The morning Elvira Bailey was supposed to sign her life away, her hand would not stop trembling. She stood at the window of the Redemption Creek General Store, watching the dust rise in lazy spirals from the unpaved Main Street, listening to the distant bellow of cattle being pushed through the eastern corridor. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was greening up in that deceptive way it had, showing color and promise in March, only to bake everything back to amber by June. Elvira had been in Redemption Creek for exactly 4 days, and in those 4 days she had not slept more than a handful of hours, had eaten almost nothing, and had spent more time studying the rough grain of the wooden floor beneath her feet than she had looking anyone in the eye. She was 24 years old, and she had run out of choices. That was the plainest way she could put it to herself, the most honest accounting. She had run out of choices, and so she had answered an advertisement in the Helena, Montana newspaper, packed the 2 dresses she owned that were still in reasonable condition, said goodbye to the boarding house she could no longer afford, and ridden south on a series of coaches and wagons until the flat, wind-scoured plains of the Panhandle had swallowed her whole. The advertisement had been simple: rancher, widower, seeking wife of good character, room, board, fair treatment. The name at the bottom had been Chester Hollies. Chester Hollies was 61 years old, and he smelled like pipe tobacco and something sourer beneath that, and he had shaken her hand at the Redemption Creek stage depot with fingers so thick and dry they had felt like old rope wrapped around her smaller ones. He had looked her over the way a man looked over a horse he was considering buying, quickly, practically, with no particular warmth and no particular cruelty, and had said, "You will do," and that had been the entirety of their courtship. The marriage papers were waiting for her on the counter of the general store, because Chester Hollies was on friendly terms with Mr. Abernathy, who ran it, and Mr. Abernathy was also a justice of the peace, and the whole business was meant to be concluded by noon so that Chester could get back to his ranch before sundown. Practical, efficient, loveless. Elvira had told herself for 3 days that she could endure it. Plenty of women endured worse. But standing at that window, watching the town of Redemption Creek move through its morning routine, she felt the trembling begin in her fingers and travel slowly up through her wrists and into her forearms, and she pressed her hand flat against the windowpane to try to stop it, and it would not stop. She heard the bell above the store door ring, and she did not turn around because she assumed it was Chester or Mr. Abernathy returning with the papers, and she was not ready. She needed 1 more minute, just 1 more minute of looking at that dusty street as a woman who had not yet signed herself over. "You are either admiring the view," said a voice behind her, "or you are thinking very seriously about going back through that window instead of facing whatever is on that counter." She turned then, because the voice was not Chester Hollies's graveled rasp, and it was not Mr. Abernathy's polite, slightly nasal murmur. It was a voice she had not heard before, low and quiet, carrying a kind of steadiness in it that made her think of water running deep rather than fast. The man standing inside the doorway was somewhere in his early 30s, tall enough that he had to angle his hat slightly to clear the door frame, and he was looking at her with dark brown eyes that held something she had not expected to find in a stranger: genuine curiosity, and something that might have been concern. He wore a rancher's working clothes, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, dust-colored trousers tucked into worn leather boots, a leather vest that had seen considerable use. His hat was pushed back slightly on his head, revealing dark hair that curled at the temples from sweat and morning heat. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved with strong opinions, and a mouth that, right now, was curved very slightly at one corner. "I am not going through the window," Elvira said, because it was the first thing that came out of her mouth, which was embarrassing. "All right," he said. "Then you are admiring the view." He came the rest of the way into the store and set a paper-wrapped parcel on the far end of the counter, apparently here on some errand of his own, and she thought that would be the end of it. He would collect what he needed and leave. But he did not move toward Mr. Abernathy's back room. He stayed where he was, and his eyes, she noticed with some irritation and some relief, were not raking over her the way Chester Hollies's had done. He was simply looking at her face, reading it the way a person reads a letter they are not sure they understand yet. "You are pale," he said. "Have you eaten this morning?" "That is a very personal question for a stranger to ask," she said, which was prim, and she knew it. "That is a fair point," he said, and he went to the jar of peppermint sticks on the counter and put a coin down beside it without asking Mr. Abernathy, because Mr. Abernathy was apparently still in the back, and he held the candy out to her. "My name is Orville Maddox. I run the Broken Spur Ranch about 6 miles northeast of here. Now we are not strangers." She looked at the peppermint stick for a moment. She had not had one since she was a child. She took it. "Elvira Bailey," she said, "from Helena." "Long way to come," he said, not prying, just acknowledging it. He leaned back against the counter and crossed his arms loosely, and there was something about the way he stood unhurried, taking up the space he needed and no more, that made the tight knot in her chest loosen slightly. "Yes," she said, "it is." "Are you here to visit someone?" he asked. She turned back to the window because she could not look at him when she answered it. "I am here to be married," she said, "to Chester Hollies." There was a silence behind her that lasted long enough that she almost turned to look at it. "Chester Hollies," Orville Maddox said finally, and his voice had not changed much, but something in the quiet weight of those two words told her that he knew Chester Hollies, and that whatever he knew was not simple. "You know him," she said. "I do," he said. "I have known him for 8 years. She waited for more, because clearly there was more, and clearly he was deciding whether to say it. "He is not a cruel man," Orville said carefully. "He is not a gentle one either. He runs a tight operation. He is a man of business mostly." He paused. "His first wife, Clara, she passed 3 years ago. Fever. Before that she was—" He stopped again. "She was very quiet." Elvira understood what he was not saying. He was saying it as kindly as he could, which was not a thing she had expected from a stranger who had wandered into a general store on a Tuesday morning and handed her a peppermint stick. "I answered his advertisement," she said. "I made a practical decision." "Yes," he said, and nothing about his tone condemned her for it, which was something she appreciated more than she could explain. The bell above the door rang again, and this time it was Mr. Abernathy, carrying a folded sheaf of papers, and behind him was Chester Hollies himself, broad and square and smelling of tobacco, his eyes going immediately to Orville Maddox with a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or merely the recognition of a man who occupied overlapping territory in a small world. "Maddox," Chester said by way of greeting. "Chester," Orville said by way of returning it. Chester's eyes moved to Elvira. "It is nearly time," he said, and it was not unkind, but it was not warm either. It was the tone of a man who had scheduled a transaction. "Mr. Abernathy spread the papers on the counter and began explaining what each section meant, and Elvira moved toward the counter because that was what you did. That was the decision she had made. She picked up the pen that Mr. Abernathy held out to her, and she found the line where her name was supposed to go, and she pressed the nib to the paper, and her hand began to shake. Not a small tremor. A deep, full-body shaking that started in her fingers and traveled up through her whole arm, and the pen scratched a meaningless line across the paper rather than anything like her name, and she pulled back and pressed her lips together and tried again, and her hand shook harder. Chester Hollies made an impatient sound, low in his throat. Mr. Abernathy looked uncomfortable. And then a hand came from beside her, warm, large, with calluses on the palm that spoke of years of hard work, and it did not take the pen from her. It simply covered her hand, steadied it, held it with a firmness that was also, somehow, entirely gentle. She looked up, and Orville Maddox was standing beside her, and he was looking not at the papers but at her face, and his expression held something she had not seen directed at her in a very long time. It was not pity. It was recognition, like he was seeing something she had not shown anyone else. "Take your time," he said quietly. And then in a voice so low that only she could hear it, "You do not have to sign anything you do not want to sign." She looked back at the paper. The pen was still in her hand. His hand was still over hers, warm and steady as a hearthstone. And then Chester Hollis said, in a tone that was too loud and too irritated and revealed rather a lot about what the next 20 years of her life would feel like, "Girl, it is a simple enough business. Stop your shaking and write your name." Something in Elvira Bailey went very still. She felt it happen, a kind of quiet crystallization, like water finding the temperature at which it becomes ice. She had been afraid of the wrong things. She had been afraid of being alone, afraid of having no money, afraid of the boarding house and the cold winters, and the disapproving eyes of a world that had little patience for women without husbands or resources. She had not been nearly afraid enough of this of a man who would call her girl and tell her to stop her shaking, as though her shaking were an inconvenience to him, rather than the outward expression of a woman who was terrified. She set the pen down on the counter. "Miss Bailey," Chester Hollis said in a warning tone. "I am sorry, Mr. Hollis," she said, and her voice was steadier than her hand had been. "I do not believe I can sign these papers." The silence that followed was spectacular in its completeness. Even the distant cattle seemed to pause. Chester Hollis's face went through several colors in rapid succession. Mr. Abernathy found something very interesting to look at on the far wall, and Orville Maddox beside her took a single slow breath. "Now see here," Chester Hollis started. "I have traveled a long way," Elvira said, "and I have considered your advertisement in good faith, and I am sorry for the inconvenience of having traveled so far to change my mind at the last moment. But I am changing my mind." She reached into the small purse she carried and counted out coins, enough for her share of the stage fare, because she did not want to owe Chester Hollis even the cost of the ticket that had brought her here. She set the coins on the counter beside the papers. "For the stage fare." Chester looked at the coins, then at her, then made a sound that was very like a disgusted snort, took his hat from the peg by the door, and left the store. The bell above the door rang with a kind of finality. Mr. Abernathy gathered his papers and quietly retreated to the back. Elvira stood at the counter with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Then she realized that her entire world, the plan she had come here with, the practical decision, the structure that was supposed to replace the freedom she no longer had just walked out the door in the form of Chester Hollis, and she had nothing. No arrangement, no money beyond what was in her purse, no place to stay past tonight, no plan at all. She began to laugh, which surprised her, because it was not a happy laugh, but it was genuine, and it was the first genuine thing she had felt in months. "All right," Orville Maddox said from beside her, and he was watching her with that same expression, that careful, unguarded attention. And he was not laughing, but he was close to it. "What do you do now?" "I have absolutely no idea," Elvira said honestly. He nodded slowly. "Can you cook?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon. Can you cook? And can you ride, or are you willing to learn? And can you manage a household without someone standing over you at every moment telling you what to do?" She stared at him. "What exactly are you suggesting?" He reached up and adjusted his hat in what she was beginning to understand was a habitual gesture that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Dunmore, left 3 weeks ago. Her daughter in San Antonio had a baby and she went to help. I have got 4 ranch hands, 1,200 head of cattle, 2 horses I am particularly fond of, a house that has gone to chaos in 3 weeks, and no idea what I am going to do about any of it." He met her eyes directly. "I am not Chester Hollis. I am not offering marriage. I am offering honest work, fair pay, and your own room in a house that is large enough that we would not be in each other's way unless we chose to be. And before you think about what people will say, Mrs. Dunmore is expected back in 4 to 6 months, so this would be a temporary arrangement." Elvira looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I can cook very well. I have ridden before. And no, I generally do not require someone standing over me." "Then we have a deal," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and warm, and he released her hand the moment the handshake was concluded, which told her something about him that words alone could not have conveyed. "I do need to ask you one thing," she said. "Go ahead. Why did you come over and hold my hand?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the counter rather than at her. Then he looked up. "Because you were shaking," he said, "and nobody should shake alone." The Broken Spur Ranch was 6 miles northeast of Redemption Creek, just as Orville Maddox had said, and the road out to it was dry and flat with occasional scrub cedar breaking the monotony of the plains, and the sky above it was the particular infinite blue that only the Texas Panhandle seemed able to produce. A blue so wide and deep and relentless it made you feel simultaneously free and very small. Orville drove the wagon and Elvira sat beside him with her 2 bags in the bed behind them, and they talked in the way that people talk when they are still learning the basic geography of each other. He had grown up in Virginia, she learned, and had come west at 22 after the war had rearranged his family's fortunes so thoroughly that staying in Virginia had become more painful than leaving it. He did not say much about the war itself, just that it had taken people he loved and left the landscape changed beyond what he could bear to look at. And she did not press him because she recognized the particular careful manner with which a person navigates around a wound that has not fully healed. She told him about Helena, about her mother, who had died 2 winters ago from a lung ailment that had crept up quietly and then moved fast, about her father, who had preceded her mother by 3 years, about the boarding house where she had taken a room and done sewing work and laundry work, and eventually ran out of enough of both to pay her way. She told him about the advertisement she had answered, and he listened without judgment and without the particular kind of sympathy that is really just pity wearing a polite hat. "You are braver than you think you are," he said when she had finished. "I am not sure that backing out of a marriage contract at the last moment counts as bravery," she said. "That is not what I was referring to," he said. The ranch, when they arrived, was exactly what a working cattle ranch looked like in the Texas Panhandle in 1878, large and functional and unapologetically worn in by use. The main house was a 2-story frame building with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, painted white at some point in its past and now more of a weathered cream. There was a barn, a bunkhouse for the hands, a pump and water trough in the yard, a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat ragged with neglect, and several outbuildings whose purposes she would learn in time. The 4 ranch hands, a quiet young man named Terrence who could not have been more than 19, a Mexican vaquero named Rodrigo who had worked the ranch for 5 years and knew it better than anyone, an older man called Hap who had the squinting, sun-weathered look of someone who had spent decades outdoors, and a newer hire named Billy who talked more than the others combined. All came out of the barn or the bunkhouse to observe the arrival of the wagon. And their observations were not unkind, but they were frank, the way men on a working ranch tend to be frank about new things. "This is Miss Bailey," Orville said, climbing down from the wagon. "She is going to manage the house." "Same as Mrs. Dunmore did. I will thank you all to treat her accordingly." There was no argument, no inappropriate commentary. Rodrigo tipped his hat. Hap nodded. Terrence looked at his boots and then at Elvira and then at his boots again. Billy said, "Welcome to the Broken Spur, miss," with what appeared to be genuine goodwill. Orville showed her the house himself, room by room, and the state of it, while not a catastrophe, was clearly the work of 4 men who had been left to their own devices for 3 weeks. The kitchen was the worst of it. Dishes stacked haphazardly, the floor needing a thorough scrubbing, the pantry in a state that suggested someone had been grabbing what was easiest rather than what was sensible. The sitting room was more dusty than dirty. The upstairs bedrooms were varied in their disorder, with the exception of Orville's own room, the door of which he opened briefly to show her the location of the extra blankets in the hall closet without actually inviting her in, and which she noted in passing was notably neat bed made, surfaces clear, nothing on the floor. Her room was at the end of the hall, smaller than his, with a window that faced east and would catch the morning light, and it had a good solid bed and a washstand with a ceramic pitcher, and it was entirely adequate and entirely her own. "There is a lock on the door," he said, pointing to it. "The key is on the nail there. That room is yours, and I will not enter it without your permission, not for any reason." "I believe you," she said, and she meant it, which was interesting because she had known him for approximately 3 hours. She spent the first afternoon bringing the kitchen back to rights. She went through the pantry methodically, took stock of what was there and what was needed, made a list in a small notebook she kept in her bag, and started on the floor. Orville came in once to see if she needed anything, found her on her knees scrubbing, and without a word took off his vest and began helping her with the stacked dishes. And neither of them discussed this. They simply worked alongside each other. And by the time the kitchen was in reasonable order, the sun was starting its descent, and the air through the open window was cooling from blistering to merely warm. She made supper cornbread and a beef stew from the dried beans and the side of beef that was hanging in the cold larder, and Rodrigo brought word to the bunkhouse, and all 4 hands came to the table in the kitchen, and Orville sat at the head of it, and they ate. The cornbread was, if she said so herself, excellent, and there was a perceptible lift in the mood around the table that told her the men had been eating fairly poorly for 3 weeks and were relieved about the change. After supper, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done, Orville was sitting at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of him, making notes in his careful handwriting by the light of the oil lamp, and Elvira sat across from him with her mending. One of her dresses had a tear that needed attention, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that did not need filling. "You settled in fast," he said, not looking up from the ledger. "I am accustomed to adapting," she said. He glanced up at that, and something moved through his expression. "That sounds like it was not always by choice," he said. "No," she said, "not always." She kept her eyes on her needle. "But tonight it is. That is something." He looked at her for a moment longer and then went back to the ledger, and she kept mending, and the lamp burned steadily between them. The weeks that followed were a kind of education, and not only in the practical matters of running a ranch household in the Texas Panhandle, though there was plenty of that. She learned that the kitchen garden could be saved if she was willing to put in the work, and she put in the work, rising early to water and weed before the heat of the day made it miserable. She learned that Hap had a bad tooth that needed a dentist in Redemption Creek, but that he had been stubbornly ignoring, and she bullied him, gently, into going, which he did with much grumbling and came back relieved. She learned that Terrence was homesick for his family in Missouri, and that he lit up like a lantern when she made a particular kind of spiced apple cake that his mother apparently also made, and she made it more often than she strictly needed to. She learned that Rodrigo was quietly, comprehensively brilliant when it came to cattle and horses and weather, and that Orville trusted him absolutely, and for good reason. And she learned Orville Maddox, in the incremental way that you learn the landscape of a place you have come to live in, first the broad outlines, then the closer details, then the small particular things that you would not notice unless you were paying attention. He was up before sunrise every morning. He worked as hard as any of his hands, harder on most days. He had a gift for quiet authority, for saying a thing once clearly and not needing to repeat it because it had been heard. He was not a man who wasted words, but when he spoke, the words he used were the right ones. He read in the evenings when the work was done, mostly history and natural science, and there was a bookshelf in the sitting room that told her he had been reading seriously for years. He drank 1 glass of whiskey after supper some evenings, and never more than 1. He never raised his voice in anger, which she noticed because she had grown up in a house where voices were raised regularly, and the absence of it felt like a particular kind of gift. He also, she noticed, watched her. Not in the uncomfortable way that Chester Hollies had watched her at the depot, evaluating, calculating. He watched her the way a person watches something they find genuinely interesting, with attention that was respectful rather than intrusive, When she said something at supper, he listened. When she made a decision about the house, he trusted it without second-guessing. When she expressed an opinion, he considered it seriously even when he disagreed. And he disagreed with her sometimes, directly and without apology. And she found she liked that too, because there is a particular loneliness in never being taken seriously enough to argue with. There was an afternoon in the 4th week when a thunderstorm came up fast from the northwest. The sky going green and the wind picking up, and the smell of rain so strong it was almost physical. And Orville was out in the north pasture, with Rodrigo and Terence getting the cattle moved before the lightning started, and the storm hit before they made it back. Elvira stood on the covered porch and watched the rain come down in sheets, and the lightning crack over the flat plain, and felt her heart hammering with the particular fear she had always had of bad weather, a fear that she had never been ashamed of, but had rarely had anyone to share with. When the 3 men came riding in soaking wet and laughing with the relief of it, Orville swung down from his horse and saw her on the porch and read her face in an instant. "It passed north of us," he said, coming up the porch steps. "No real damage." "I know," she said. "I could see it passing." He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the cold of the rain he was still wearing, and he looked out at the retreating storm with her. "You do not like lightning," he said. "I do not like feeling helpless," she corrected. "Lightning is fine, it is the waiting that gets me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother was the same way. Every storm she would stand at the window and just watch it, would not move until it was past. She said if it was going to get her, she wanted to see it coming." "That sounds exactly right," Elvira said. He turned and looked at her, and something in the way he was looking at her, the directness of it, the warmth of it, made her look back in a way she had been carefully not doing. The rain was still coming down beyond the porch roof, softer now, and the air had that washed clean smell that only comes after a real storm, and she was aware, sharply and suddenly, that she did not want to be anywhere else in the world at this particular moment. "You are soaking wet," she said, because she needed to say something practical. "I am," he agreed, and there was something in the slight smile he gave her that suggested he knew exactly why she had said it. She went inside to get a towel and he went upstairs to change, and when they came back to the kitchen and she put the kettle on for tea, the moment had passed into the ordinary rhythm of the evening, but it had not passed entirely. It remained like the smell of rain after the weather had moved on. Rodrigo noticed, she was fairly certain of that. He was too observant not to, and he had the particular quality of a wise man who knew when to say nothing and when to speak, and on this matter he had chosen, so far, to say nothing. Terence noticed in the oblivious way that 19-year-olds notice things, blushingly, and then very thoroughly pretending he had not noticed. Hap and Billy were occupied primarily with their own business and appeared uninterested in the domestic atmosphere of the main house. What Elvira was less certain of was whether she herself had a clear understanding of what was happening to her, or whether the clarity she was beginning to feel about Orville Maddox was something she was prepared to trust. She had been careful with her heart. She had been careful with it for a long time, because the world she had lived in, the boarding house world, the alone in a cold city world, had not been generous with it, and she had learned to protect it the way you protect anything valuable that you cannot afford to replace. She had built herself a practical orientation toward life, and it had served her well, and it had also kept her from the kinds of feeling that had no practical application and could not be organized into a ledger column. But Orville Maddox was doing something to that careful arrangement without seeming to try very hard, and the thing that was most disorienting about it was that he was doing it simply by being exactly who he was. There was no performance in him that she could detect, no presentation of a man designed to impress or persuade. He was just himself, directly and without apology, and what that self contained was turning out to be rather remarkable. It was Rodrigo who brought the matter to a head, in the indirect way that Rodrigo brought most things. It was a Wednesday evening in the 5th week, and Orville had ridden into Redemption Creek on business and was not expected back until supper time, and Elvira was in the kitchen garden pulling the last of the spring carrots when Rodrigo came past on his way to the barn, leading a horse that had thrown a shoe. "Miss Bailey," he said, stopping. "Rodrigo," she said, sitting back on her heels. He looked at her with those steady, dark eyes that had seen a great deal in their 40-some years. "You know what Orville was like before you came," he said. "It was not a question." "I did not know him before," she said carefully. "No," Rodrigo said. "I know you did not. I am telling you. Before you came, he worked. He managed the ranch. He ate his supper and he read his books and he slept and he worked again, every day, very efficiently, very alone." He paused. "He has not been alone since you came, not in the way that matters." Elvira looked at the carrot in her hand. "He is my employer," she said. "Yes," Rodrigo said serenely. "He is," and he continued to the barn with his horse and said nothing more on the subject. She was turning this over in her mind when Orville came back from Redemption Creek that evening, and he came back with something she had not expected, news that made her heart drop and then rally in quick succession. Sat down at the kitchen table while she finished making supper, and he said, "I heard something in town today that I thought you should know. Chester Hollis has been talking." She kept her face toward the stove. "About me. About you leaving," he said. "About you being employed here. He is not saying anything overtly scandalous, but he is letting people draw their own conclusions, which amounts to the same thing." She turned to look at him. "Does it concern you, what people in town are saying?" He met her eyes steadily. "What concerns me," he said, "is whether it concerns you, and whether it changes anything about your situation or your comfort here. I have never been particularly susceptible to the opinions of people who do not know me," she said. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of quiet relief, she thought, and also something warmer than that. "Good," he said. "Then it does not need to be a problem." She brought supper to the table and sat across from him, and they ate, and the lamp burned steadily, and after a moment she said, without having planned to say it, "Rodrigo spoke to me today." Orville looked up from his plate. "He told me what you were like before I came," she said. Orville was quiet for a moment. He set down his fork. He looked at the table and then at her, and he said, "I expect he was accurate." "Very efficient," she said. "Very alone." "Yes," he said simply, not defending it, not explaining it away, just acknowledging it. "And now?" she asked, because she was brave enough, apparently, to ask it. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that the lamp flame flickered once in a draft from the window and steadied again. Then he said, "Now is considerably better." It was not a declaration. It was not even close to one, not in any formal sense. But it was honest, and it was his, and it was more than Elvira had expected, and it was enough to make her feel something loosen further in the careful architecture she had built around herself. "I think," she said, choosing her words, "that I came to the Texas Panhandle running from something, and I accidentally arrived somewhere worth being." The corner of his mouth moved, and his eyes did something warm and complicated, and he said, "I think you arrived exactly where you were supposed to be." And then he picked up his fork again, and she picked up hers, and they finished their supper. And outside the window the stars were coming out over the flat plains in the millions, the way they only do in places where there is nothing between you and the sky. Summer arrived in the Panhandle the way it always did, without apology and without mercy, the temperature climbing in great dry waves that turned the grass to gold and silver and made the horizon shimmer. Elvira adapted. She learned to be up before the worst of the heat, to do her outdoor work in the morning and her indoor work in the afternoon, to drink more water than felt reasonable, and to carry her hat everywhere. She also learned to ride. Orville taught her. He had a mare named Patience, which he had named with some irony, he said, because the horse had very little of it, that was actually quite responsive to a confident rider, and was willing to tolerate a learning one as long as the learning was genuine. The first lesson was on a Saturday morning when the hands had the day partly off and the world was quiet, and Orville was patient in a way that his horse was not, standing at the fence and talking her through the basics with the same quiet authority he brought to everything, And by the end of the morning she was walking and trotting in the paddock, and he was watching her from the fence with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of pleased. "You are a natural," he told her. "You are lying," she told him. "I am not," he said. "You have good instincts. You are not fighting the horse." "I am absolutely fighting the horse," she said, but she was also laughing, and the mare, apparently satisfied with the morning's work, tossed her head in what might have been agreement. By the end of the month she was riding out with him in the mornings when his work allowed it, not into the working parts of the ranch where she would be in the way, but along the creek that ran at the property's eastern edge and up into the low hills where the juniper grew, and the view went for what felt like forever. He showed her things, the places where the deer came to water, the particular rock formation that his first ranch hand had called the Old Woman because of how it looked in profile, the way the light came in across the plains in the late afternoon when it was golden and low, and made everything look like it was being seen through amber glass. He told her things, too, on those rides. He told her about Virginia, the specific town, the family house that had been his grandmother's, the apple orchard that he had climbed in as a boy. He told her about coming west, about the first 2 years when nothing had worked and the money had run dangerously low, and he had taken every job he could find. He told her about buying the broken spur land from a man who had overextended himself and needed to sell fast, and about the years of building it into what it was, and the particular pride that was not arrogance but was simply the satisfaction of having made something from almost nothing with your own hands and your own work. She told him things in return. She told him about her mother, who had been funny and fierce, and had read to her every night of her childhood, and about the particular grief of watching someone you love get smaller and smaller before they go. She told him about the dreams she had quietly given up on, not dramatic dreams, just ordinary ones, the kind that involved having a home that was hers and knowing where she would be in a year, and having people around her who knew her name and the sound of her laugh. "You have some of those things now," he said on one of those mornings, pulling his horse to a stop on the crest of the low hill. She stopped Patience beside him. Below them, the ranch lay spread out in the morning light, the white house, the barn, the kitchen garden that was producing beautifully now, the bunkhouse where she could already see Rodrigo and Terrence starting on the morning chores. "I know," she said. "It surprises me every day that I do." He turned to look at her. The morning light was full on his face, and she could see every line of it, the lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting in the sun, the slight scar on his jaw from some long-ago incident he had mentioned briefly and dismissed. The way his expression right now was open in a way she had come to understand was not easy for him and was therefore, when it happened, entirely real. "Elvira," he said. "Yes," she said. "I need to say something," he said. "All right," she said, and her heart was doing something complicated and she made no effort to stop it. "I was not looking for this," he said. "I came into the store that morning. I was not looking for anything other than the supplies on my list. And then you were standing at that window and—" He stopped and looked out at the ranch below and then back at her. "You were shaking so hard and you were still so determined not to sign something you knew in your bones was wrong. And I thought I had never seen anyone both so frightened and so certain at the same time." "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That was what made it." She waited. "I do not want to presume," he said. "You came here as an employee. I have done my best to make sure you understand that this is your home for as long as you need it to be, without conditions. And if what I am about to say changes that in any way that makes you uncomfortable, I need you to tell me and I will take it back and we will go on as we have been." "You have not said it yet," she pointed out. That slight, particular smile. "No," he agreed. "I have not." He looked at her directly, and there was nothing in his expression except what was actually there, a man who was a little afraid and being honest about it. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you for some time, and I thought you should know it." The wind moved through the juniper below them, making a sound like breathing. The sky was the absolute blue of a Texas summer morning. Patience shifted under her and settled, and Elvira sat on the horse and felt the words land in her chest and spread outward from there, warm and steady, like sunlight on stone. "Orville," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think," she said slowly, "that I started falling in love with you the moment you put that peppermint stick in my hand and told me we were no longer strangers." He looked at her, and whatever had been held carefully and precisely in his expression released all at once, and what was underneath it was something she wanted to look at for a very long time. "I have been trying," he said, "to be careful, to not move too fast or too presumingly. You had already been placed in one situation where a man expected more than he had a right to expect." "You are not Chester Hollis," she said. "No," he agreed. "I am not." "And I am not the woman who stood at that window shaking," she said. "Or I am, but I am also considerably more than that, and I think you know the more than that better than anyone." "I do," he said. Patience made an impatient sound below her. Elvira laughed, the genuine, unguarded laugh that she had not had enough occasion to use in years. "Your horse named Patience is extremely impatient," she said. "Deeply ironic," he agreed, and he was laughing too, and they turned the horses back down toward the ranch, and the morning light came with them all the way home. It was Hap who found out about Chester Hollis first. Hap came in from Redemption Creek on a supply run in the 3rd week of August, and he came in with a particular set to his jaw that meant he had something to say and was deciding how to say it, and he found Orville in the barn and said it directly, which was Hap's way. Chester Hollis had been telling the story around town, and the story had grown in the telling the way stories do when they are given time and willing ears. In the current version of it, Elvira Bailey had come to Redemption Creek not as a mail-order bride, but as something considerably less respectable, and her current residence at the Broken Spur was described in terms that were designed to damage both her reputation and Orville's. Orville listened to this with his hands quiet and his face still, and then he thanked Hap and went to find Elvira. She was in the kitchen, putting up preserves. The tomatoes from the garden had come in all at once, and she had been working through them methodically, and she looked up when he came in, and whatever was on his face made her set down the jar she was holding. He told her plainly, all of it. She listened, and he watched her face as she processed it, and he saw the brief, sharp hurt of it, the unfairness, the old familiar sting of being a woman whose reputation was the most fragile thing she owned and therefore the most available target. And then he saw something else come up behind the hurt, something firmer and brighter. "Chester Hollis," she said quietly, "is a man who expected to purchase something and was told it was not for sale. He is making noise the way such men do." "Yes," Orville said, "and I intend to go into Redemption Creek and correct the record." "What does correcting the record look like?" she asked. He looked at her with the direct, unguarded attention that was so wholly his. "It looks like me asking you a question I have been working up to for some weeks," he said. "And if your answer is yes, then we go into town together and the record corrects itself." She understood him. She understood him completely. She was aware that her heart was doing something that would have been entirely foreign to the woman who had stood at the window of Abernathy's General Store in March, shaking so hard she could not write her name. "Ask me," she said. "Elvira Bailey," he said, and his voice was the same steady low that had been the first thing she noticed about him, the thing that had cut through her fear like a hand laid flat on a trembling one. "Will you marry me?" Not because of Chester Hollis or reputations, or any practical consideration. "Because I love you and I want to spend every morning and every evening and every ordinary day in between with you, and because I think we are better together than either of us has managed to be alone." "Yes," she said, clearly and without hesitation, because she was certain. She was absolutely certain in the way that she had not been certain of anything in a very long time, and the certainty felt like solid ground under feet that had been walking on uncertain terrain for years. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands in his, and she was not shaking. She was the steadiest she had been in years. But he held her hands anyway, firmly and gently, and looked at her face, and she looked at his, and they stayed like that for a moment that she thought she would be able to recall with perfect precision for the rest of her life. They went into Redemption Creek the following week, on a Thursday, because Mr. Abernathy still served as justice of the peace, and there was a certain satisfaction in returning to the same room where the whole story had begun. Mr. Abernathy, to his credit, looked genuinely pleased. He had been uncomfortable about the Chester Hollies business from the start. He was, at his core, a decent man who did not like being the setting for something that had felt wrong from the moment he had watched Elvira Bailey's hand shake over his counter. All 4 ranch hands came. Rodrigo stood at the back of the store with his hat in his hands and the quietest, most satisfied expression Elvira had ever seen on a human face. Terence had combed his hair with evident care. Hap wore his good shirt. Billy managed to say only one inappropriate thing, and then caught Rodrigo's eye and stopped. The marriage papers were on the same counter they had been on in March, and Mr. Abernathy set them out and explained the relevant sections, and Elvira took up the pen. Her hand began to tremble, just slightly, a small tremor born not of fear this time but of the enormity of it, the reality of this moment, the weight and the wonder of choosing something and having it be the right choice, and knowing it while you were still in the middle of it. And Orville was beside her, just as he had been in March, but everything was different and they both knew it. He covered her hand with his warm, steady, certain. And this time he did not say take your time, because there was no urgency to manage, no impending freight train of wrong decision to avoid. Instead he said, quietly only for her, his voice carrying everything he was and everything he felt, "You will never shake alone again." She looked at him. He was looking at her face, not the papers, and his eyes were dark and warm and absolutely sure. She looked back at the paper. She steadied the pen, and she signed her name Elvira Bailey, clear and full and unhesitating, the signature of a woman who knew exactly what she was signing and chose it freely and completely. Orville signed his name beside hers, and Mr. Abernathy witnessed it, and that was how the thing was done in a general store in Redemption Creek, Texas, on a Thursday in August of 1878, with 4 ranch hands and a very satisfied Rodrigo looking on. Afterward, Billy insisted on buying a round of lemonade from the barrel outside the saloon, because the saloon also sold lemonade, and they stood on the main street in the afternoon heat and drank it, and Terence made a toast that was very sincere and somewhat incoherent, and Hap clapped Orville on the shoulder once with the particular wordless approval of a man who does not express himself easily but feels things deeply, and Rodrigo said quietly to Elvira, "I told you," and she said, "You did," and he said, "Good," and that was all he said about it. Chester Hollies was visible briefly outside the hardware store across the street. He saw them. He looked at Orville. He looked at Elvira. He looked at the lemonade, and the group of them gathered in the street in the kind of easy, genuine celebration that is impossible to manufacture. He went into the hardware store without speaking, and that was the last they had to do with Chester Hollies, who was not a cruel man and was not a kind one, and who would find, Elvira thought, whatever practical arrangement he was looking for eventually, and who would have to live in the meantime with the knowledge that he had called a woman girl and told her to stop shaking, and she had put down the pen, and she had been right. The first autumn of their marriage was, Elvira thought later, the most purely contented season of her life. The heat broke in September with a dramatic northern wind that came overnight and dropped the temperature 30 degrees, and she woke that morning to find Orville already up and in the kitchen making coffee, something he did only when he had been awake for some time already, and she came down in her robe and sat at the table, and he put a cup in front of her, and she wrapped her hands around it and breathed the steam. And outside the window the grass was moving in the new wind and the sky was doing something spectacular with its clouds. "It smells like October," she said. "In September," he said. "Texas." "I like it," she said. He sat across from her with his own cup and looked at her with the expression she was coming to think of as simply his face, The one that appeared when he was not managing anything or presenting anything, just being in the room with her. "I like it too," he said, but he was looking at her rather than the window when he said it. She learned new things about him in the closeness of marriage that she had not known from the closeness of employment. Not because he had concealed them, but because there are things about a person that only show themselves in the particular intimacy of sharing a life. She learned that he dreamed sometimes of Virginia, and she could tell by the particular quiet he had in the morning after, not sad, exactly, but interior, looking at something that was not in the room. She learned that he kept a small collection of pressed wildflowers in the back of his science book, placed there years ago by someone he had once loved, whose name he told her one evening simply and without drama. A woman named Ruth who had died of typhoid in 1871 before they could be married, and about whom he had grieved completely and kept faith with her memory by never trying to replace what she had been with a copy. Elvira had listened to this with the attention it deserved and had said, "I am sorry about Ruth," and he had said, "I was too," for a long time, and she had understood that this was why he had been alone, and why he had filled the aloneness with work and books and the methodical building of something real, and why it had taken someone arriving in his life in the most unexpected possible way to crack that careful arrangement open. She loved him for it, not despite the sadness it implied, but in some way because of it, because a man who grieved properly and honestly and did not drown it in bitterness or cruelty or carelessness was a man she could trust with the tender things. Mrs. Dunmore returned in October, as she had said she might, traveling up from San Antonio with a new granddaughter described in the letters she had sent as absolute perfection, and she arrived to find the ranch house in better order than she had left it, the kitchen garden bursting, and the domestic situation considerably altered from the one she had departed. She was a stout, white-haired woman with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had been managing difficult things for decades, and she took in the situation. Orville and Elvira married, the house running smoothly, Rodrigo and the hands looking better fed and more cheerful than they had any right to be given the season, with the comprehensive eye of a person who notices everything and says what she thinks. "Well," she said to Elvira, on the first afternoon, over tea at the kitchen table, "I wondered how long he would stay lonesome." "He was not exactly forthcoming about it," Elvira said. "He never is," Mrs. Dunmore said. "He is a man who works up to things in his own time and in his own way, and you cannot push him or he digs in. But when he decides a thing, he decides it completely." She looked at Elvira with a direct, assessing gaze that was not unkind. "You look like someone who has found their footing." "I have," Elvira said. "I think I had been looking for it for quite a while." "Hardest thing in the world," Mrs. Dunmore agreed, "finding where you belong. Most people never manage it." She poured more tea. "He is a good man, not a perfect one, too stubborn, and sometimes he closes up when he should open, and he does not always know how to ask for help, but good, genuinely." "I know," Elvira said. "I figured out the stubborn part on my own." Mrs. Dunmore laughed, which was an infectious sound, large and surprised. "Yes, I imagine you did." Mrs. Dunmore stayed for the winter as she always did, and Elvira discovered that having her there was not a reduction of her own place in the household but a multiplication of it, an extra pair of capable hands, an extra intelligent perspective, a companion during the long winter days when the men were outside and the house was quiet. They developed an efficient domestic partnership that made the running of the ranch household considerably smoother than either could have managed alone. Orville watched this development with something that looked very much like quiet happiness, the satisfaction of two people he cared about getting on well, which he had apparently not been entirely confident would happen. "You were worried about it," Elvira said to him one evening, catching the particular quality of his relief. "I was not worried," he said. "You were," she said. "You were watching us at supper like someone who was hoping not to have to intervene in a conflict." He looked at her sideways and the corner of his mouth moved. "Mrs. Dunmore can be forthright," he said carefully, "So can I," Elvira said. "I am aware," he said. "That was the source of my concern." "We are perfectly fine," she said. "I noticed," he said. "You are relieved," she said. "I am," he admitted, and she laughed and he laughed, and that was the end of it. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a hard one, cold in a way that the Panhandle could be brutal, with ice storms that made the work outside dangerous and slow, and the nights inside very long. Elvira kept the house warm and the kitchen busy, and learned to read the sky the way the ranchers did, looking for the particular steel-colored cloud formations that meant real weather was coming, learning what the wind direction told you, understanding why Orville and Rodrigo both watched the horses in the morning, because the horses knew things about the coming weather that no human instrument had learned to record yet. She also discovered in the first week of December that she was going to have a baby. She told Orville on a Sunday evening when the first hard snow of the season was coming down outside, and the fire in the sitting room was the warmest place in the world. And she told him simply and directly because that was how they talked to each other. And he went very still for a moment. And then he looked at her with an expression she did not have language for, a kind of amazed, overwhelmed, deeply grateful quality, like a man who has been given something he had stopped allowing himself to hope for. "Elvira," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you well?" he asked immediately, practically, typically Orville. "I am very well," she said. "A little tired, a little queasy in the mornings, but very well." He reached across the space between them and took her hand and held it in both of his and looked at it for a moment and then looked at her face. "I did not know," he said, "that I wanted this. Until this moment, I did not let myself know it." "I know," she said gently. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Somewhat," she said honestly. "I expect I will be more frightened and less frightened at various points over the next 8 months. I trust that you will hold my hand steady through the parts where I am shaking." He looked at her with everything he had and said, very quietly, "Every part of it, every single part." Mrs. Dunmore was enormously pleased and also immediately practical about it, which was exactly the right combination of responses, and she extended her stay without discussion because it was not, she said, something that required any discussion. The winter passed. Spring came again to the Panhandle. That deceptive, beautiful, green for a moment spring, and Elvira's pregnancy progressed with the steady inevitability of something that knows exactly what it is doing regardless of whether the humans involved feel adequately prepared. She continued to manage the house, somewhat more slowly and with somewhat more assistance than she was accustomed to accepting. She stopped riding in the 5th month on Orville's gentle but firm advice, and she missed the morning rides more than she expected to. But she found new ways to use the mornings, sitting on the porch in the early light with her coffee and her books, and the view of the ranch coming to life around her, which was not, she decided, a bad alternative. Orville was attentive in the way that is most valuable, not hovering, not treating her as fragile but present. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He redistributed the household tasks without making it into a production. He sat with her in the evenings and they read together, and sometimes she fell asleep in the chair, and he put a blanket over her and let her sleep rather than waking her, which she discovered in the morning by the evidence of the blanket, and the fact that the lamp had been turned down, and the tenderness of the gesture, the smallness and the certainty of it, made her sit for a moment in the morning quiet and feel the full weight of her own good fortune. Their son was born in July of 1879, on a Wednesday, during a thunderstorm that Elvira would have found frightening under other circumstances, but was too busy to pay much attention to. He arrived after a labor that was long and demanding, and attended by Mrs. Dunmore and the town's physician, who had ridden out from Redemption Creek in the rain without complaint, and Orville spent the hours of it in the way that men of the era spent such hours, outside the room, in the hall, wearing a groove in the floorboards. And when Mrs. Dunmore finally opened the door and told him he could come in, he came in with a face that was the most unguarded thing Elvira had ever seen on any human being. Their son was small and red and remarkably opinionated about his arrival in the world, and his first act was to announce his presence at considerable volume. And Orville sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him with the same expression he had given Elvira in December, that overwhelmed, deeply grateful amazement. And then he looked at Elvira, who was exhausted and entirely triumphant, and he said, "Are you all right?" And she said, "I am spectacular." And he laughed, and she laughed. And the baby, perhaps in response, said something emphatic. They named him James. James Robert Maddox, for Orville's father and Elvira's grandfather. He was, from the beginning, a boy of strong opinions and direct communication, which Elvira thought was either inevitable or poetic justice, depending on how you looked at it. The ranch expanded in the years that followed. Orville brought in additional grazing land to the south, negotiating the purchase with careful patience over many months, and the cattle operation grew accordingly. He hired 2 additional hands, young men from families he knew in the region, boys who needed work, and whom he trained with the same patient authority that characterized everything he did. The Broken Spur became known in the county not just for its operation, but for the way it was run. Fair wages, decent treatment, a place where people stayed because they wanted to rather than because they had nowhere else to go. Rodrigo remained through all of it, the anchor of the ranch's daily competence, and he was godfather to James, and eventually to the daughter who came 3 years later, Clara, named with Elvira's quiet deliberateness for Chester Hollis's first wife, the woman who had been very quiet, who had deserved better, who could at least be given the small posthumous honor of a name carried forward by someone who would not be quiet at all if she had any say in the matter. Clara proved immediately and comprehensively that she would have a great deal to say in every matter she encountered. She was Elvira's coloring, dark-haired, pale-skinned, with eyes the same gray-green as the sage, and she was Orville's disposition in a very particular way. She watched everything, absorbed everything, and when she decided something, she decided it completely. Terence, who had stayed on at the Broken Spur long past the age at which most young hands moved on to try their luck elsewhere, became, somewhere in there, family in the way that some people do, not by blood, but by the accumulation of shared meals and shared work and shared winters, and the particular bond of people who have been through things together. He was the first person James ran to when he learned to walk, which Elvira thought told you everything you needed to know about both of them. Hap retired to Redemption Creek in 1882, his joints having finally lost the argument with decades of outdoor labor, and Orville helped him set up in a small house on the edge of town with enough financial settlement that he could live without worry. And this was done without fanfare, and without Hap being asked to express gratitude, because that was how Orville handled things that he believed were simply right. Billy eventually married a girl from a neighboring ranch and moved east toward Amarillo, and his departure was marked by a supper that ran long and got genuinely loud, and Elvira made his favorite pie peach, which she had perfected over the years, and Billy made an emotional speech that nobody could quite follow but everyone appreciated. The Chester Hollis matter resolved itself in the way such matters generally do when they are left alone long enough to lose oxygen. He found a woman in the county to marry eventually, a widow, practical and self-possessed, who appeared to know what she was getting into and managed it on her own terms. Elvira heard this from Mrs. Abernathy in town one afternoon and felt nothing particular about it, except the mild relief of a thing that had once been a sore spot healing over properly. The general store in Redemption Creek remained Mr. Abernathy's, and Elvira went there frequently for supplies and occasionally for conversation, and the counter where she had once stood shaking and put down the pen and changed the direction of her life was just a counter in a store, and she touched it sometimes when she passed it, not with sentiment but with simple acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a place that mattered. The town of Redemption Creek grew in those years, as Texas grew, as the country pushed west and settled and spread, and the railroad came closer, and changed the geometry of the cattle trade and the shape of daily life. There was a proper church built in 1881, and a school in 1883 that both James and Clara eventually attended, riding in with Orville on his weekly town trips, or, as they got older, on their own horses, James on a bay gelding of his own, and Clara on a small paint mare that she had, with utter confidence at age 6, simply declared was hers. And nobody had argued, because Clara at 6 was not the sort of person you argued with without excellent preparation. In the autumn of 1884, on the anniversary of the day they had signed the marriage papers in Abernathy's store, Orville rode out with Elvira to the low hill above the creek, the one they had ridden to on those summer mornings years ago when things were still new and not yet said. James was 9, Clara was 5, and both were with Mrs. Dunmore, who still came for winters and had evolved from housekeeper to something more like family. And the afternoon was the particular golden kind that October sometimes produced when it was feeling generous. They sat on the hill and looked out over the ranch below, the white house with its long porch, the barn, the kitchen garden in its end-of-season abundance, the bunkhouse where Rodrigo and the newer hands were visible doing the evening work, the smoke beginning to come from the kitchen chimney where Mrs. Dunmore was starting supper. 6 years, Orville said. 6 years, she agreed. If I had not needed peppermint sticks, he said. She laughed. If I had not stood at the window long enough for someone to notice I was there. He looked at her, and it was the same look it had always been, direct and warm and entirely sure, and 6 years of mornings and evenings had not diminished it, which was something she had not entirely expected and was entirely grateful for. "Are you happy?" he asked her. He asked it sometimes, just like that, simply and directly, because he was a man who wanted to know the actual answer and would not be satisfied with the social one. "Orville," she said, "I am so happy that sometimes I stand in the kitchen in the morning, and it surprises me." "Good," he said, and reached over and took her hand, and held it with the same warmth and steadiness that had been there from the beginning, from the moment he had laid his hand over her trembling one on a counter in a general store and said, "Take your time." And she had felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not alone. The sun was going down in a spectacular arrangement of color over the flat plains to the west, rose and gold, and that deep violet that appears only at the moment the day decides to become the evening. And they sat on the hill above their home and watched it happen. She thought about the woman she had been in March of 1878, the woman who had climbed off a stage in a town she did not know, who had gone to sign her life over to a practical arrangement because she had run out of choices, who had stood at a window and shaken, and finally, in one of the bravest moments of her life, put down the pen. She thought about all the things that woman had not known were waiting, not just Orville, though Orville was the center of it, but the ranch and the horses and the kitchen garden, and the cooking and Rodrigo's particular wisdom and Terrence's particular sweetness, and the flat endless blue of the Panhandle sky, and the thunderstorms and the October gold light, and the small red person who would become James, and the determined, decisive person who would become Clara. She had not signed those papers, and the world had turned out to contain so much more than the life that had been on the other side of them. "What are you thinking about?" Orville asked. "Peppermint sticks," she said. He made the sound that was his laugh when he was genuinely caught off guard by something, a brief, real sound that she loved disproportionately, and he said, "I will buy you the whole jar if you want." "You have given me considerably more than a jar of peppermint sticks," she said. "You have given me more than I knew how to ask for," he said quietly, and the sun was very low now, and the ranch below them was settling into the warm lamplight of evening, and James and Clara were down there with Mrs. Dunmore, and a good supper was being made, and all of the threads of the life they had built together were woven tight and whole and entirely real. She squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and they sat on the hill until the last of the color left the sky, and the stars began their nightly performance over the Texas Panhandle, the same stars that had been up there every night of her life in Montana and his life in Virginia. The same stars that had been over Redemption Creek when she arrived knowing no one. The same stars that had looked down on two people in a general store, one of whom was shaking and one of whom had quietly reached over and steadied her. The stars did not change. The people beneath them did, slowly and well, in the direction of themselves. They rode back down to the ranch in the dark, which they knew well enough by now to navigate without difficulty, every slope and turn of the path familiar as breathing. And the horses found the barn with the confidence of animals that know where home is, and they unsaddled and brushed them down side by side in the lamplight of the barn, working in the comfortable silence that had been one of the first and best things she had learned about Orville Maddox. That silence with him was not empty, but full. Mrs. Dunmore had supper on the table. James had apparently spent the afternoon attempting to convince Rodrigo to teach him a card trick, and had been successful on the second attempt, and was deeply pleased about this. Clara had made something with her paper and her paints that she presented to both her parents with the absolute conviction of an artist who knows her work is good and wants credit for it. And it was, in fact, rather remarkable, a horse and a house and two figures that were clearly meant to be her parents, painted with the bold certainty of a child who does not yet know she is not supposed to be this certain. "This is us," Clara told them, pointing at the two figures. "It is," Orville agreed seriously. "I made you taller," Clara told him, examining her own work with a critical eye, "because you are tall." "That is very accurate," Elvira said. "I know," said Clara. They put her painting on the kitchen wall, where it joined a small collection of objects that Elvira had accumulated over the years on the surfaces and walls of the house. Nothing expensive or decorative for its own sake, but things that meant something. A pressed wildflower from the first spring, dried now and mounted in a simple frame. A piece of ribbon from James's christening. A small photograph, taken in 1882 by a photographer who had come through Redemption Creek, of Orville and Elvira and a 2-year-old James on the porch of the house, all three of them squinting slightly in the bright sun and Orville's hand around her waist, and the photograph somehow capturing, in the frozen flatness of its image, the living warmth of the thing it depicted. Supper that evening was long and good and loud, the way it had become over years of practice, Rodrigo quiet at his end, James talking about the card trick, Clara issuing opinions on various subjects with the confidence of someone who has not yet discovered that not everyone finds her opinions equally compelling, Mrs. Dunmore maintaining the kind of benign domestic authority that keeps a full table from descending into chaos, and Orville at the head of it, looking around at all of it with the expression that Elvira had come to understand was what 6 years of being loved the right way looked like, wearing itself on the outside. After supper, after the children were in bed and Mrs. Dunmore had retreated to her room and Rodrigo had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Elvira and Orville sat in the sitting room in their customary places. She in the chair that had become her chair, he at the desk that held his ledgers and his books, and the lamp burned between them the way it always had. She was reading. He was going over accounts. Outside, the night wind moved across the Panhandle with its low, particular sound, and somewhere distant a coyote called once and went quiet. "Orville," she said. He looked up. "I want you to know something," she said. "All right," he said. "I have thought sometimes about what would have happened if I had signed those papers in March of 1878, if my hand had been steadier, or if I had been more afraid of the alternative, or if you had not come into that store when you did." She looked at him directly. "And I cannot make that world make any sense to me any more. It does not fit, like trying to remember the details of a dream after you have been awake long enough." He was looking at her with his full attention, the ledger forgotten. "This is my life," she said. "This house, this ranch, these children, you, this is the thing that makes sense, and I want you to know that I know it." Not just in the ordinary way of knowing something you have gotten used to, but the way you know something that cost you something to find. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp flame was entirely steady. "I know it too," he said, "the same way." "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. She went back to her book. He went back to his ledger. The wind moved outside, and the house was warm, and their children were sleeping in the rooms above them, and Rodrigo, and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the horses were in the barn, and the kitchen garden was going dormant for the winter, and would come back in the spring the way it always did, reliably, persistently, full of itself. In the spring of 1885, Elvira planted a new section of the kitchen garden herbs and a small section of wildflowers that had no culinary purpose at all, that she planted simply because she wanted them, because she had reached the point in her life where there was room for things that had no purpose except to be beautiful. The wildflowers came up in May in a riot of color, Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets, and a variety of things she did not know the names of and did not require herself to name. And they were the finest thing in the yard that spring, and Clara was beside herself with them. And James picked his mother a small handful of the bluebonnets on a Tuesday morning for no reason, except that he passed them on the way from the barn, which was the most Orville thing that James had ever done. And Elvira put them in a glass on the kitchen windowsill and looked at them all day with a full heart. James grew into a boy who was quiet and steady and good with horses and numbers, and later with people, who had his father's manner of saying a thing once and meaning it, and his mother's habit of watching a room before speaking. Clara grew into a girl who was loud and decisive and entirely certain of herself, who had her mother's stubbornness and her father's directness, and something else entirely that was only Clara, some particular quality of conviction that was going to take her somewhere remarkable, and everyone could see it coming from the time she was 4. The Broken Spur Ranch became one of the well-regarded operations of the county, not famous, not spectacular, but solid and honest and lasting, the kind of place that was there in 15 years and would be there in 50. Orville ran it with the same quiet authority and genuine fairness that had characterized everything he had built from the beginning, and Elvira ran the house and the garden and the accounts of her own household, and eventually, because Mr. Abernathy's eyesight was failing him, kept the books for the general store as well, because she had a talent for numbers that she had never had occasion to use and had now found its application. They were, in the language of the time and the place, a successful couple. But what they were, in the language that does not require a time or a place, was something simpler and better and harder to achieve. Two people who had found each other by accident, in a general store, in the dust and heat of a Texas morning, one of them shaking with fear and the other with the particular grace to notice, and who had built from that accidental beginning something that was as real and as lasting as anything the wide sky of the Panhandle had ever looked down on. On a morning in the late spring of 1886, Elvira stood at the kitchen window, a different window from the one she had stood at in Abernathy's store 8 years before, but a window nonetheless, looking out at a different scene. The ranch yard in the early morning light, Rodrigo crossing toward the barn, James already helping with the horses at 13 years old, Clara sitting on the porch fence with her hat on backward watching everything with that comprehensive gaze, Orville coming from the barn toward the house with the particular purposeful stride of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is glad to be going there. He came up the porch steps and through the door and found her at the window with her coffee, and he came to stand beside her the way he had stood beside her on the porch during that thunderstorm years ago, shoulder close to shoulder, looking out at the morning. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood there for a moment together, and outside in the yard Clara said something to Rodrigo that made the old vaquero tip his hat back and laugh, and James led a horse out of the barn into the morning light, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and the biscuits she had put in the oven, and the wind was coming from the south and it was warm. Her hand was perfectly steady. It had been steady for a long time now, but even so, even now, with everything settled and sure and good, when Orville reached over and took it in his own, warm and firm and certain, she felt the same thing she had felt in that general store when he had done it the very first time. The bone-deep, specific relief of not being alone. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched their morning together, and the world was wide and full of everything they had made of it, and it was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.